Mr. Cole, your wife and her CEO are locked inside your private suite. Would you like me to have them removed? Natalie Brooks asked the question at exactly 11:47 on a Thursday night, and for several seconds, I said nothing. I stood beside the window of a standard room on the 12th floor of the Halcyon Grand, looking down at Chicago traffic sliding through the rain like streams of red and white fire. My tie was loose. My jacket hung over the back of a chair. On the desk sat a paper keycard sleeve with room 1218 printed across it in black ink. 42 floors above me, my wife was inside a suite that had never belonged to her boss. It belonged to me. Are you certain they are both inside? I asked. My voice sounded calm, almost detached, but my wedding ring suddenly felt heavier than anything made of gold should feel. Natalie paused before answering. She had managed the Halcyon for 9 years. She did not exaggerate, and she never called me after hours unless something had gone seriously wrong. Mrs. Cole used her authorized guest card at 9:36 p.m. Mr. Vale entered with her. No other guests have accessed the suite. They ordered champagne, dinner for 2, and breakfast for 2 at 7 tomorrow morning. They also requested that no calls be transferred upstairs. Rain tapped against the glass. Soft, patient, relentless. I looked at my reflection in the window and barely recognized the man staring back. 44 years old, gray beginning at the temples. A face built more by long meetings and quiet decisions than by anything dramatic. Claire used to say that steadiness was what she loved most about me. Lately, she called it a lack of ambition. Security can be at the door in 3 minutes, Natalie continued. I only need your approval. I closed my eyes, and the day replayed itself in sharp, clean images. Claire standing at the front desk in her navy dress. Richard Vale arriving with 2 assistants and the kind of smile that expected every room to open for him. The black keycard sliding across polished marble. Claire taking it before I could reach for it. Her voice low and impatient as she told me Richard needed the suite more than I did. Then the sentence that stayed with me all evening. Please do not make this awkward, Ethan. This is my world. I had watched her hand my room to another man as though she were correcting a clerical mistake. As though I were the mistake. The young clerk behind the desk had looked at me, waiting for an objection. I had simply nodded. Give me whatever is available. Claire had exhaled with relief, not gratitude. Relief. That was the part that cut deepest. Not that she had chosen her CEO's comfort over mine, but that my silence made her evening easier. Mr. Cole, Natalie said, should I send security? My hand tightened around the phone. The old version of me wanted the door opened immediately. He wanted explanations under bright hallway lights. He wanted Claire to see that there were limits to what a husband could absorb without breaking. But anger is loud, and truth rarely needs help making noise. Somewhere above me, Richard Vale believed he had taken the best suite in the building. Claire believed she had protected her future by keeping her unimpressive husband out of the way. Neither of them understood whose name sat behind the trust that owned the hotel, whose signature approved its budgets, or whose decision could close every door they expected to walk through tomorrow morning. I opened my eyes. My reflection looked different now. Not stronger. Clearer. No, I said. Do not knock. Do not call the room. Do not let them know we are aware. Natalie went quiet. Understood. Is there anything else? Preserve the keycard records, hallway footage, room service receipts, and every request made under that reservation. Make copies before morning. I will handle it personally. I looked up toward the dark glass tower disappearing into the clouds. And Natalie? Yes, Mr. Cole. Let them sleep. The words surprised even me. They sounded almost merciful. They were not. Mercy would have been removing them before they made the mistake complete. Tomorrow, I said, I want them to walk into that ballroom believing they won. I ended the call and placed the phone beside the keycard sleeve. For years, I had wondered whether Claire still respected the man she married. At 11:47 that night, I finally received my answer. What she did not know was that morning would bring one question of its own. Not whether I would forgive her, but how much of her carefully built world would remain standing after everyone learned who I really was. 7 hours earlier, Claire had taken the keycard from the front desk as if it had always belonged in her hand. Rain streaked the tall windows of the Halcyon Grand, turning downtown Chicago into a blur of headlights and silver glass. I had just set my overnight bag beside the marble counter when the young clerk smiled and said, "Welcome back, Mr. Cole." Your suite on the 42nd floor is ready. Claire turned toward me so quickly that one of her earrings caught the chandelier light. The 42nd floor? She asked. I could hear calculation enter her voice before surprise had fully left it. The clerk nodded. The private suite, ma'am. Claire looked across the lobby toward Richard Vale, who had arrived with 2 assistants and 3 pieces of luggage. He stood near the brass elevators, speaking into his telephone while an employee held an umbrella over his shoulder, even though he was already indoors. Richard had a way of occupying space without asking permission. His suit was charcoal gray, his shoes shined like black glass, and every person around him seemed to move half a step faster. Claire leaned closer to me. Richard needs a proper place to host the senior team tonight. The conference has 3 executive meeting rooms, I said. They are already reserved. Her smile tightened. That is not the same thing. She glanced toward Richard again. He has investors flying in from New York. He cannot entertain them in an ordinary hotel room. I studied her face. There had been a time when Claire would have laughed at the idea of measuring people by the size of their rooms. Back then, we ate takeout on the floor of our first apartment because we could not afford a dining table. Somewhere along the way, square footage had become a language she respected more than loyalty. And where do you expect me to stay? I asked. She gave a small sigh, the kind people use when explaining something obvious to a child. Anywhere else. It is one night, Ethan. The clerk lowered her eyes toward the computer screen. She knew enough not to interrupt, but I could see uncertainty in the way her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Claire reached across the counter. Transfer the suite to Richard Vale. Put my husband in whatever standard room is available. The clerk looked at me. Not Claire. Me. Mr. Cole, I would need your authorization. Claire's expression changed for half a second. Irritation moved behind her eyes, quick and cold. He authorizes it, she said. Do you not, Ethan? Richard ended his call and approached us before I could answer. Claire immediately straightened her shoulders. We solved the room issue, she told him. You will have the top suite. Richard smiled as though she had handed him an award. That is why you are indispensable. He placed one hand lightly against the middle of her back. The gesture lasted only a moment, but familiarity has its own weight. I noticed it. Claire noticed me noticing it. She stepped forward, away from his hand, then covered the movement by reaching for the keycard. Richard has been under enormous pressure, she said. I am only trying to make this weekend run smoothly. He looked at my travel bag, then at my raincoat. You do not mind roughing it, do you, Ethan? His tone was friendly enough for anyone who did not know how contempt worked. Claire says you are low maintenance. Claire says many things, I replied. His smile paused, then returned. Claire pushed the black keycard toward him. It crossed the marble counter with a soft scraping sound. Such a small sound. Still, I remember it more clearly than the thunder outside. Richard picked it up between 2 fingers and read the room number. 4200, he said. Now that sounds more appropriate. Claire laughed. Not loudly. Not cruelly. That almost made it worse. She laughed as though pleasing him had become instinct. The clerk still had not moved. Mr. Cole, she asked again. I could have stopped it with one word. I could have explained who owned the building, whose office approved the renovation budget, and why the private suite was never offered to ordinary guests. But Claire was watching me with a warning in her eyes. She believed I was about to embarrass her. She did not understand that I was giving her one last chance to remember who I was without being told what I had. Make the change, I said. The clerk swallowed. Yes, sir. Claire relaxed immediately. Relief softened her face. She turned to Richard and began describing the view from the upper floors, speaking as if she had arranged every detail herself. I picked up my bag. Where am I going? I asked. The clerk printed a new sleeve and slid it toward me. Room 1218, sir. Claire barely glanced at it. That is fine. You will probably sleep better away from all the executives. Richard chuckled. Some men are built for quiet floors. Claire touched my arm, but there was no warmth in it. Please do not make this awkward, Ethan. This is my world. The elevator doors opened behind her. She and Richard stepped inside together. His assistants followed. Just before the doors closed, Claire looked back at me, not with guilt, but with impatience, as though I were an unfinished task she planned to handle later. Then the polished doors met, cutting her face in half before hiding it completely. I stood alone beneath the chandelier while the storm pressed against the windows. The new keycard felt thin in my hand, almost weightless. Yet as I watched the elevator numbers climb toward 42, I understood that Claire had not merely given away a room. She had placed a value on both of us, and in her calculation, her husband had come second. By the time I reached the ballroom, the rain had faded into a cold mist against the windows, and the halcyon grand had transformed itself for the Meridian Dynamics reception. Crystal glasses caught the light. A string quartet played near the terrace doors. Waiters moved between clusters of executives carrying trays of champagne and small plates that looked too perfect to touch. I had changed into a dark navy suit and left my wet coat upstairs, but room 1218 still seemed to follow me into the crowd. Claire stood near the center of the room beside Richard Vale, laughing at something he had said. She wore the same navy dress from the lobby, though now she had added a silver company pin above her heart. Richard held a glass in one hand and rested the other against the back of her chair. Not touching her. Not quite. Some distances reveal more than contact ever could. Claire saw me approach, and the smile on her face tightened before she turned it into something presentable. "There you are," she said. "I wondered whether you were coming down." "You told me the reception started at 7. I replied. "It is 7. Richard checked his watch and smiled. "Punctual. I respect that." His tone suggested punctuality was the most impressive thing he expected from me. Claire introduced me to the people around the table. Mark Davidson, Chief Financial Officer. Susan Keller, Senior Vice President of Operations. 2 board advisors from New York. When she reached me, she hesitated for half a beat. "And this is my husband, Ethan." Susan smiled politely. "Claire tells us you work in investments." Before I could answer, Claire gave a small laugh. "That makes it sound grander than it is. Ethan stepped away from full-time work a while ago. He manages a few private investments and keeps a very flexible schedule." The words were technically clean and completely dishonest. She did not mention the hotel beneath our feet. She did not mention the hospitality trust. She did not mention the years I spent rebuilding failing properties while she slept beside spreadsheets spread across our kitchen table. She had taken an entire life and reduced it to a flexible schedule. "So you are retired?" Mark asked. "Not exactly," I said. Richard leaned forward. "Then what fills the day?" A few people smiled into their glasses. Claire answered for me again. "He reads, meets with advisors, travels when he feels like it. He has been fortunate." Fortunate. That was the word people use when they want success to sound accidental. Richard raised his glass. "A man supported by good timing and a successful wife. That is not a bad arrangement." The laughter came gently at first, then spread around the table as people looked to Claire for permission. She gave it to them. Her laugh was soft, polished, and familiar. I had heard it at birthday dinners, neighborhood cookouts, and quiet Sunday mornings when our marriage still felt like a place we both lived. Hearing it now felt like finding my name erased from a photograph. "You must be proud of her," Susan said, perhaps trying to soften the moment. "I am proud of what Claire has accomplished," I replied. "She worked hard for it." Claire looked relieved. "She wanted my loyalty, even while spending mine." Richard tapped his glass against hers. "She is one of the few people here who understands how power actually works." Claire lowered her eyes with a smile that was almost private. "I learned from the best." Something passed between them. It was not dramatic. No one else seemed to notice. That was what made it dangerous. Familiarity had settled into their pauses, their timing, the way Claire knew when Richard wanted another drink before he asked. I began remembering small things I had dismissed over the past 6 months. His name appearing on her telephone after midnight. Her new perfume on business trips. The way she defended him during dinner even when I had not criticized him. One detail means nothing. 5 details become a pattern. A pattern becomes a door you cannot close. Richard turned to me again. "Claire says you prefer staying out of the spotlight." "I prefer knowing what the spotlight is hiding," I said. His smile weakened for a second. Claire placed 2 fingers on my sleeve. "Ethan has a dry sense of humor." "I can see that," Richard replied. Then he looked toward the upper floors visible through the glass ceiling above the atrium. "I appreciate you giving up the suite. A man should know when someone else needs the room more." Claire stared at me, silently asking me to let it pass. Around us, the quartet continued playing as if nothing had shifted. I set my untouched drink on the table. Sometimes a room tells you more about the person who takes it than the person who gives it up. Richard studied me, uncertain whether he had been insulted. Claire knew. I saw it in the sudden stillness of her face. Before she could respond, An assistant approached and whispered something into Richard's ear. He nodded, then turned to Claire. We should review tomorrow's presentation. Upstairs. Privately. There are numbers I do not want discussed here. Claire answered too quickly. Of course. She looked at me and forced a casual smile. Do not wait up. This may take a while. Then she followed Richard toward the elevators, leaving her champagne unfinished beside mine. I watched them cross the ballroom together. At the doors, Richard placed his hand near the small of her back, guiding her inside. Claire did not move away. The doors closed, and for the first time that evening, the laughter around me sounded very far away. I remained beside the ballroom doors until the elevator numbers stopped at 42. For a moment, the small red light stayed there, steady and silent, as if the building itself were asking whether I understood what I had just seen. I understood enough. I simply did not yet know how much truth waited behind that door. The reception continued around me. Glasses touched. People laughed. The quartet moved into a slower song. No one noticed that my marriage had entered an elevator and gone upstairs without me. I returned to the table and found Claire's telephone charger beside her unfinished champagne. She had left it behind in her hurry. 6 months earlier, I would have carried it to her. That night, I placed it in my pocket and walked away. I did not follow them. Following would have given Claire an argument to hide behind. She could have called me jealous, controlling, insecure. People often attack the question when they are afraid of the answer. I took the elevator down to the 12th floor instead. Room 1218 was clean, quiet, and ordinary. A queen bed stood against one wall. A framed photograph of Lake Michigan hung above the desk. From the window, the city looked smaller than it did from the owner's suite, but the truth does not change with altitude. I set Claire's charger beside the lamp and loosened my tie. At 8:42, I sent her a message. I asked whether she knew how long the meeting would last. The message showed as delivered. No answer came. At 9:03, I tried again. I told her I had her charger. Still nothing. At 9:18, she finally responded. Do not wait for me. Richard needs my complete attention tonight. The sentence sat on the screen longer than it should have. Complete attention. She could have written that the financial review was complicated. She could have named the executives in the room. She could have told me when she expected to return. Instead, she chose words that closed the door without explaining what happened behind it. I put the telephone face down. For years, I had defended Claire against my own instincts. When she returned late from dinners, I called it ambition. When she began carrying her telephone from room to room, I called it privacy. When she stopped inviting me to company events, I called it professionalism. A marriage can survive difficult truths. What it cannot survive forever is one person doing all the explaining for the other. At 9:36, somewhere 42 floors above me, a keycard touched a lock. I did not know that yet. I only knew the room felt colder, though the thermostat read 72 degrees. I turned on the television and lowered the volume until the voices became a distant murmur. At 10:11, Claire's message disappeared from my screen because she had activated the feature that erased conversations after viewing. She had never used it with me before. That small detail settled something inside me. Suspicion is restless. Certainty is quiet. I crossed the room and opened the curtains. The halcyon's glass reflected my face back at me while rain traced crooked lines across the city. 16 years earlier, I had stood in this same building when half the floors were dark and the bank was preparing to close it. I had promised the employees that if they gave me 1 year, I would give them a future. Natalie Brooks had believed me before anyone else did. She was an assistant manager then, working double shifts because the hotel could not afford another supervisor. Together, we rebuilt the place one contract, one repaired room, and one honest decision at a time. Claire knew those years existed. She simply never asked what they became. At 10:38, the room telephone rang once, then stopped. A minute later, it rang again. I answered, but no one spoke. I heard only the faint click of a disconnected line. I wondered whether someone at the front desk had tried to reach me and changed their mind. At 11:06, a message arrived from Claire. Big morning tomorrow. Please do not create tension. I read it twice. She was warning me about my behavior while refusing to account for her own. I typed 3 different replies and deleted all of them. Words written in pain usually become tools for someone else. I set the telephone beside the lamp and waited. At 11:32, footsteps passed my door, followed by laughter from guests returning to their rooms. Then silence settled over the hallway. At 11:47, my personal telephone began to ring. Natalie's name appeared on the screen. She never called that number for routine problems. I answered on the second ring. Her voice was controlled, but something underneath it had tightened. "Mr. Cole, I apologize for contacting you this late, but there is a situation involving the private suite." I looked toward the rain-dark window. "Tell me exactly what happened." She explained the access records, the room service order, and the request for complete privacy. Then she paused. "Your wife and Mr. Vale are still inside. Security is ready. Would you like me to remove them?" I stared at the wedding ring on my hand. One answer could have ended their night. A different answer could reveal who they truly were by morning. "No," I said. "Leave the door closed." After I ended the call, I remained by the window with the telephone resting in my hand. 42 floors above me, Claire and Richard believed privacy belonged to whoever held the key. They were wrong. Privacy was a courtesy. Ownership was something else entirely. I had learned that difference 16 years earlier, when the Halcyon Grand was not a landmark, but a failing building with more debt than guests. Back then, rain came through the ballroom ceiling. Half the elevators did not work. The restaurant closed before dinner because there were not enough customers to justify keeping the kitchen open. Newspapers called the hotel outdated. Bankers called it unrecoverable. I called it worth saving. I was 28 years old, working for a restructuring firm that specialized in distressed properties. My job was supposed to be simple. Review the accounts, identify what could be sold, and prepare the hotel for liquidation. I arrived with a laptop, a gray suit, and no emotional attachment to the place. Then I met the employees. Natalie was an assistant manager working 14-hour days because 2 supervisors had already left. Luis in maintenance kept ancient boilers running with replacement parts he built himself. Mrs. Parker had cleaned rooms there for 31 years and knew the names of guests who had not visited in a decade. They were not numbers on a balance sheet. They were people waiting for someone to decide their work still mattered. The owners had stopped believing. The bank wanted the land. I saw something neither side could see because both were looking only at what the hotel had become. I was looking at what it could become. I used nearly every dollar I had saved to form a small investment partnership. The rest came from 3 people willing to trust a young man with an unpopular idea. We purchased the property through a holding company before the foreclosure deadline. I did not become wealthy that day. I became responsible. For the first year, I slept in room 814 because I could not afford an apartment and needed to be close whenever something failed. I inspected plumbing before sunrise, negotiated vendor contracts during lunch, and carried luggage when the front desk was overwhelmed. Natalie and I met every morning at 5:30 over coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard. We cut waste without cutting dignity. We renovated 1 floor at a time so employees could keep working. We invited local businesses back, rebuilt the conference program, and turned the empty restaurant into a place people crossed the city to visit. The Halcyon did not recover because of one brilliant decision. It recovered through thousands of quiet ones. Claire met me during the second winter. A heating line had failed during a charity reception, and I was in the lobby wearing work boots and an old sweater, helping Louise carry tools. Claire was there as a junior communications consultant. She thought I was part of the maintenance crew. I never corrected her. She brought me coffee, held a flashlight while I checked a service panel, and laughed when dust covered the sleeve of her white coat. We ate breakfast the next morning at a diner 2 blocks away. She talked about building a career that mattered. I talked about restoring places people had given up on. She did not ask what I earned. I did not ask what she could do for me. For years, that memory was proof that she had loved the man before she understood the assets. Maybe she had. People do not always become false overnight. Sometimes they change one compromise at a time until the person beside them feels like a witness to someone else's life. As the Halcyon grew, I placed it under Cole Hospitality Trust and kept my name away from publicity. I wanted the hotel known for its service, not its owner. Later, the trust acquired 6 more properties across the Midwest. Claire knew I attended investment meetings and reviewed contracts. She knew our life was comfortable. What she never knew was how much authority rested behind my quiet schedule, because she gradually stopped asking. When I tried to explain a new acquisition, she checked her telephone. When I mentioned a financing agreement, she said hotel details made her tired. Eventually, she created her own explanation. I had been fortunate. I had stepped away. I managed a few investments. That version of me was easier for her to dismiss, and tonight, easier for Richard to mock. I looked around room 1218. The lamp, the carpet, the framed photograph, even the mattress had been selected through budgets carrying my approval. Claire had given away the finest suite in my building because she believed the man receiving it held more power than the man surrendering it. She had mistaken silence for weakness and modesty for emptiness. I sat at the desk and removed my wedding ring, not as a decision, but as a question I was no longer afraid to ask. Then I opened my contact list and called Daniel Mercer, the attorney who had structured every layer of the trust. He answered on the third ring, his voice alert despite the hour. "Ethan, what happened?" I watched rain slide down the glass. "I need you at the Halcyon before sunrise," I said. "Bring the Meridian file." "All of it," Daniel said. He would arrive before 5 in the morning, leaving me alone with 3 hours of silence and more memories than I wanted. I sat at the small desk in room 1218 while the city dimmed beyond the rain, and I began tracing the distance between the woman I married and the woman who had walked into that elevator. The change had not arrived with one confession or one obvious betrayal. It had come quietly, disguised as ambition, fatigue, and ordinary stress. Claire stopped asking how my meetings went. At first, I barely noticed. We had been married for nearly 12 years, and long marriages develop shortcuts. You stop explaining every detail because you believe the other person already understands the shape of your life. When I mentioned that the trust was considering a property in Milwaukee, she nodded while reading a message. When I told her we had completed a difficult refinancing agreement, she smiled without looking up. Eventually, I stopped bringing those things home. Silence filled the space where curiosity used to live. Then Richard Vail entered her conversations. At first, he was only the new chief executive officer who demanded too much and slept too little. Claire complained about his standards, his impossible deadlines, and his habit of rewriting presentations minutes before meetings. Within months, the complaints became admiration. Richard understood the market. Richard knew how to command a room. Richard never apologized for wanting more. His name began appearing at our dinner table even when he was not invited. I remember one Sunday evening when I cooked salmon on the grill while Claire answered messages on the patio. The sun was setting across the backyard, and the air smelled like charcoal and fresh-cut grass. I asked whether she wanted to open a bottle of wine. She smiled at her telephone and said, "Richard thinks our expansion plan could change the company." She did not hear my question. I told myself she was excited about work. I wanted that explanation to be true because it asked nothing painful of me. Then she started traveling more often. Boston, New York, Dallas. She used to send photographs of hotel views and bring home small things from airport shops. Later, her trips became blank spaces. She stopped telling me where the team ate dinner. She stopped calling before bed. When I asked whether Richard traveled with them, her expression hardened. "He is the chief executive officer, Ethan. Of course he travels." The answer was reasonable. The anger behind it was not. One night, her telephone lit up on the kitchen counter while she was upstairs. Richard had sent a message at 12:14 in the morning. All I could see was the beginning. "You were the only one who understood." Claire came down, saw the screen, and picked up the telephone so quickly that her coffee spilled across the counter. She blamed the late hour and said the message concerned a board dispute. I cleaned the coffee while she changed her password. That should have been the moment I asked harder questions. Instead, I chose peace, or what I called peace. Real peace does not require one person to ignore the sound of a lock turning. There were smaller cuts after that. She began criticizing the way I dressed for company events. My suits were too conservative. My shoes looked practical. My stories were too detailed. She suggested I stay home from a holiday reception because senior leadership would be there and she needed to focus. When I attended another dinner, she introduced me without mentioning my work, then laughed when someone assumed I was unemployed. On the drive home, I told her the joke bothered me. She stared through the windshield and said, "You know who you are. Why do you need strangers to know?" It sounded wise until I realized she was one of the strangers. The clock beside the bed changed to 2:30. I looked at Claire's charger resting near the lamp. She had remembered Richard's presentation, his preferred suite, and his need for privacy. She had forgotten the one object that connected her to the husband downstairs. That felt almost too perfect, like our marriage had reduced itself to a symbol without asking permission. At 3:07, Natalie sent a secure message confirming that every relevant record had been preserved. She added one detail that made the room seem smaller. Claire had called the front desk from inside the suite and asked that my name be removed from the reservation entirely. Not transferred. Removed. I read the message twice. Giving away the room could have been explained as ambition. Erasing my name required intention. At 4:41, someone knocked softly on my door. I opened it and found Daniel Mercer standing in the hallway with a leather briefcase in one hand and a thick blue folder in the other. His silver hair was damp from the rain, and his expression carried the calm of a man who had already begun assembling facts. He stepped inside, placed the folder on the desk, and looked at the wedding ring lying beside my telephone. "Before we discuss Meridian," he said, "tell me how much Claire knows about Northbridge." I looked toward the dark window. "Almost nothing." Daniel opened the folder. "Then by breakfast, she is going to learn everything." Daniel opened the blue folder and arranged the documents across the desk with the precision of a man who trusted paper more than promises. The first page showed Meridian Dynamics at the top, followed by 6 months of financial correspondence, hotel contracts, and proposed investment terms. I reached for it, but Daniel placed one hand over the page. "Before Northbridge," he said, "we need to separate the personal betrayal from the corporate misconduct. If you mix them too early, Richard will call this revenge. We will give him no such defense." I nodded. That was why I had called Daniel. Pain wanted speed. Strategy wanted order. At 4:56, Natalie arrived carrying a slim laptop and a sealed envelope. She had changed from her evening uniform into a dark business suit, but the concern in her eyes had not changed. "Everything has been preserved," she said. "No one outside this room knows why." She placed the laptop on the desk and opened a secure file. The first record showed Claire's guest card entering the private suite at 9:36 in the evening. Richard's temporary executive card registered 11 seconds later. No other card accessed the room until a service employee arrived at 10:04. The employee never entered. The order had been accepted at the door. "What did they request?" Daniel asked. Natalie read from the receipt. 1 bottle of vintage. Champagne, 2 entrees, 1 dessert, and breakfast service for 2 at 7 in the morning. "How was it charged?" I asked. Her expression tightened. "To the Meridian Conference Master account." Daniel leaned back. "That matters." Natalie moved to the next record. At 10:22, Richard had called the front desk and requested that the suite be listed under his name alone. When the employee explained that the reservation could not be altered without owner authorization, Claire took the telephone. She identified herself as Meridian's senior vice president and stated that she had authority to make changes on behalf of the company. She then asked that my name be removed from all visible guest records. Did the employee comply? I asked. "Only on the printed welcome screen," Natalie said. The original reservation history remained untouched. Daniel wrote a note. Misrepresentation of authority, attempted alteration of records, and personal expenses charged to a corporate account. He spoke without emotion, but every phrase landed with more weight than anger could have carried. Natalie hesitated before opening the video file. "There is one more item. The hallway camera does not record inside the suite. It covers only the elevator, corridor, and doorway. I want that distinction clear." "Show us," I said. The screen displayed the 42nd floor hallway at 9:35. Claire stepped out of the elevator first, with Richard close behind her. They were alone. She laughed at something he said, then used the black keycard to unlock the suite. Before the door opened, Richard reached for her hand. She did not pull away. They stood there for several seconds, close enough that no explanation involving spreadsheets or financial projections could make the scene innocent. Then Claire leaned toward him and kissed him. It was brief, quiet, deliberate. No dramatic gesture, no hesitation. The door opened, and they disappeared inside. The hallway became empty again. Natalie paused the recording. The room around me seemed to lose its sound. I had imagined betrayal as something explosive, but the truth arrived without noise. A small movement on a silent screen. A choice completed in less than 5 seconds. Daniel looked at me, waiting. "Save 3 encrypted copies," I said. My voice remained steady, though my hands had gone cold. 1 for hotel counsel, 1 for the Meridian investigation, and 1 for my personal attorney. "Already prepared," Natalie replied. She handed Daniel the sealed envelope. Inside were certified copies of the keycard log, service receipts, telephone notes, and the unedited camera file. I looked again at the frozen image of Claire standing before the door. I wanted to search her face for confusion, pressure, or regret. There was none. She looked certain. That certainty freed me from the last excuse I had been carrying for her. Daniel closed the laptop. "You have enough for the marriage," he said. "Now we determine what this does to Meridian." Natalie added one final detail. At 1:14 in the morning, Mr. Vale contacted the night manager. He asked whether the champagne and dinner could be described as an investor hospitality expense. He said the board did not need unnecessary details. Daniel gave a slow nod. There it is. Richard had not only crossed a personal boundary. He had used company money, falsified the purpose of the expense, and tried to conceal the record before sunrise. I stood and placed my wedding ring into the inside pocket of my jacket. "Do not confront them," I told Natalie. "Serve breakfast exactly as requested." She studied me carefully. And after that, I looked toward the first pale line of morning forming beyond the glass. After that, they can explain the expense to the people whose money they thought they were spending. Daniel waited until Natalie left before sliding the Meridian file toward me. Dawn had begun to brighten the edge of the curtains, turning the rain above Chicago into a pale, silver haze. The hotel was waking below us. Delivery trucks entered the service lane. Kitchen lights appeared one by one. Somewhere on the 42nd floor, breakfast for two was being prepared for people who still believed the morning belonged to them. Daniel opened the first financial statement. "Meridian has a larger problem than Richard has admitted publicly," he said. "Their expansion created growth on paper, but it consumed nearly all available cash. 2 major clients delayed payment, and a credit agreement comes due in 11 days. I studied the figures. Meridian dynamics looked strong from the outside. Revenue was rising. Offices were opening. Richard appeared in business magazines beside headlines about fearless leadership. Beneath that polished surface, the company was struggling to meet its obligations. "How much do they need?" I asked. $120 million, Daniel replied. "Without it, they risk violating their lending terms. Once that happens, the banks can restrict operations, demand asset sales, or force leadership changes." He turned another page. The Northbridge Strategic Fund logo appeared at the top. Northbridge was not a public name. It existed behind private partnerships, pension investments, and carefully structured capital agreements. I had created it 8 years earlier to invest in companies that possessed real value but had lost financial discipline. The fund did not rescue executives. It protected businesses from their mistakes. Richard believes Northbridge is sending an anonymous investment committee to his presentation this morning, Daniel continued. He has spent 6 months trying to secure this meeting. Does he know I control the final vote? No. The communication has gone through outside counsel. Claire does not know either. I leaned back and remembered how often she had mentioned the mysterious investors during the past several weeks. Richard was certain the deal would make him untouchable. Claire believed helping him close it would place her next in line for the chief operating position. She had stayed late, canceled dinners, and treated every question from me like an obstacle to a future I could not understand. All that time, the future she wanted had been waiting for my signature. Daniel placed a draft financing agreement beside the financial statements. My name did not appear on the cover. It appeared on the final approval page. 1 line, 1 signature, $120 million. Power rarely announces itself with a raised voice. Sometimes it waits quietly at the bottom of a document. Under normal conditions, would you approve this? Daniel asked. I reviewed the projections. Meridian employed more than 4,000 people. Most had nothing to do with Richard or Claire. They were engineers, account managers, technicians, and administrative staff who depended on responsible leadership. The company is worth protecting, I said. That does not mean the executives are. Daniel gave a small nod. Then we separate Meridian from Richard Vale. We freeze approval, request an emergency governance review, and give the independent directors an opportunity to act. Who can call the meeting? Olivia Grant. She chairs the audit committee. She has questioned Richard's expenses before, but she lacked enough evidence to force an investigation. I looked toward the sealed envelope containing the hotel records. Now she has evidence. At 5:38, Daniel called Olivia from his secure telephone. He identified himself as counsel for Northbridge and explained that information had emerged affecting the proposed financing. He did not mention my marriage. He described only the corporate facts, unauthorized personal expenses, an attempted alteration of hotel records, possible misuse of executive authority, and efforts to disguise the charges as investor hospitality. Olivia listened without interruption. When Daniel finished, she asked one question. Can the records be authenticated? I answered before he could. Yes. Silence followed. Who is speaking? She asked. Ethan Cole. Another pause. My name meant something to her, though not yet everything. Mr. Cole, are you representing the hotel? I own it, I said. I also hold final approval authority for the Northbridge financing. The silence on the line changed. It was no longer uncertainty. It was recognition. Olivia requested the certified records and promised to convene the independent directors before the scheduled presentation. She asked us not to alert Richard. I want him to speak exactly as he planned, she said. People reveal the most when they believe no one can challenge them. When the call ended, Daniel closed the folder. The financing is officially frozen. At that same moment, my telephone lit with a message from Claire. She wrote that breakfast had run late. Richard was under tremendous pressure, and I needed to leave the hotel before the investor meeting. Her final sentence was simple. Please do not embarrass me today. I read it once, then placed the telephone beside the unsigned agreement. She thinks I am the risk, I said. Daniel looked toward the sunrise spreading over the city. By noon, she will understand that you were the only reason the deal existed. At 7:20 that morning, I entered the private dining room beside the ballroom and chose a table near the windows. Chicago had emerged from the storm washed clean and colorless, the river below reflecting a strip of pale morning sky. Meridian executives gathered around white tablecloths, speaking in careful voices about projections, investor confidence, and the presentation that would decide the company's future. No one paid much attention to me. That suited me. Daniel sat 2 tables away with the blue folder closed beside his coffee. Natalie moved through the room greeting guests, her expression as composed as ever. Only the 3 of us knew that the most important decision of the day had already been delayed. Richard and Claire arrived at 7:43. They were 18 minutes late. Richard wore the same charcoal suit from the reception, though his shirt was fresh and his tie had changed. Claire had replaced her navy dress with a cream business suit. Her hair was perfectly arranged, but the silver earrings from the night before still caught the light when she turned her head. She saw me immediately. Her steps slowed. Richard followed her gaze and smiled. Ethan, he said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. I hope the smaller room did not keep you awake. A few executives looked over. Claire gave me a warning glance before sitting beside him. Richard, she said softly, but there was no real objection in her voice. He poured himself coffee. I am only asking. A good night of sleep matters before a major meeting. I slept well enough, I replied. That was true. Once certainty arrived, exhaustion had nowhere left to hide. Claire set her leather portfolio on the table. You are still here. I am. I sent you a message. I read it. Her smile remained in place for the people around us, but her eyes sharpened. Then you know how important this morning is. Richard reached for a plate of fruit. Claire has worked harder than anyone to make this financing happen. Today could change her career. He spoke as though her career belonged partly to him. Maybe she believed it did. I understand what is at stake, I said. Richard gave a quiet laugh. Do you? Mark Davidson, Meridian's chief financial officer, approached our table carrying a cup of coffee and several pages of notes. The Northbridge representatives have not identified themselves yet, he said. Legal says they may already be in the hotel. Richard leaned back with easy confidence. They are testing us. Investors like theater. Daniel lifted his cup at the other table without looking in our direction. Claire glanced toward the ballroom entrance, then returned her attention to me. Ethan, could we speak privately? We stepped into the corridor outside the dining room. The doors closed behind us, softening the conversation inside. Claire folded her arms. Why are you doing this? Eating breakfast? Staying. She lowered her voice. You do not belong in that meeting. The sentence settled between us with remarkable clarity. I had spent years making excuses for the way she minimized me. Now she was saying it without disguise. Why not? I asked. Because this is a corporate financing presentation, not a family event. Richard will be speaking to people who control more money than you can imagine. I cannot spend the morning worrying that you will make some comment about last night. What happened last night? Her eyes shifted toward the dining room doors. We worked. That is all. In the private suite. It had the space we needed, with champagne and dinner for two. The color in her face changed, but her voice remained controlled. You checked the hotel records? The hotel contacted me. Why would management contact you? She asked. For the first time, confusion broke through her confidence. I let the question remain unanswered. Claire stepped closer. Whatever you think happened now is not the time. Richard is under enormous pressure. If this deal closes, he has promised me the chief operating position. Everything I have worked for depends on today. Everything. You know what I mean. I looked through the glass doors at Richard laughing with the executives around him. He appeared relaxed because he believed the only people with power had not yet entered the room. Claire followed my gaze. Please go home, she said. Do not embarrass me in front of the people who matter. There it was again. The measurement she had made in the lobby, now spoken more clearly. People who mattered were those with titles, money, and rooms above the clouds. A husband she believed ordinary did not qualify. I will not embarrass you, I said. Relief appeared too quickly on her face. Thank you, but I am staying. Her relief vanished. Ethan. The ballroom doors opened behind us, and Natalie stepped into the corridor. The presentation room is ready, she announced. All Meridian executives and invited financial representatives should take their seats. Richard emerged from the dining room and adjusted his cuffs. As he passed me, he smiled. Try to enjoy the view from the back of the room. Claire touched my sleeve one final time. This is the most important day of my career. I looked at her hand until she removed it. I know, I said. That is why I would not miss it. She turned away, frustrated, and followed Richard toward the ballroom. I remained beside Natalie as the executives filed past us. When the corridor emptied, she handed me a black keycard identical to the one Claire had given away the day before. Your access has been restored, Mr. Cole, she said. I closed my fingers around it. Keep the suite vacant. Then Daniel joined us with the blue folder under his arm. Through the ballroom doors, Richard's voice rose above the room as he welcomed the investors he had spent 6 months trying to impress. Daniel looked at me. Ready? I watched C.